Throughout U.S. history, Black people have been configured as socio-legal non-persons, a subgenre of the human. Being property once myself delves into the literary imagination and ethical concerns that have emerged from this experience. Joshua Bennett argues that animal figures assert a theory of Black sociality and combat dominant claims about the limits of personhood. He turns to the Black radical tradition to challenge the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness in discourses surrounding the environment and animals. Here, Bennett discusses Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and how birds and flight are used in the novel to portray Black masculinities. Being Property Once Myself, Blackness and the End of Man, by Joshua Bennett. How might we configure the limits and lacunae of the Black masculine as a mode or means of thinking gender? What does it call into being or put under erasure the moment it arrives on the scene? What texts, both inside and outside the realm of literary criticism, are available to the contemporary reader interested in parsing out the ways in which Black boys and men move through text at the level of representation and symbol, which is to say, what lessons do we glean from the U.S. American literary canon about what Black men are, how they live, or whether their living is always already a spectacular kind of dying? Further, if one were to respond to such a claim, or question of Black male social life as a form of death in the negative, how might we theorize and historicize the ways in which death has come to serve as the dominant frame for thinking Black male experience in the U.S. and abroad? For the purposes of this chapter, I'm interested in working through and against discourses that imagine little else for Black men beyond the grave, and furthermore in gathering such materials to think toward a theory of the Black masculine that shatters prevailing pathological assumptions about what such lives can bear or bear forth, and ultimately aims to build something fresh from the shards. Toni Morrison's oeuvre is a singular resource for such an endeavor. There is already an extensive body of work on the ways in which her characters open up new worlds for thinking identity across lines of perceptible difference, alternate realities that avail to us more transgressive models for race, gender, and disability in particular. Though much has been written about Morrison's work in this vein, few scholars have explored the role of non-human actors and non-human animals in particular. In Morrison's ongoing argument against strict, bounded markers of identity that leave no room for growth or play. Such characters abound in Morrison's fiction: Here Boy, Seth, and Denver's Dog and Beloved, the horses ridden by the tribe of blind warriors in Tar Baby, and the flock of birds that follows the titular characters of Sulla, all come to mind, but rarely do such animal characters take center stage as a means through which a given character becomes an object of analysis. In one of Morrison's novels in particular, Song of Solomon, I will argue Morrison's emphasis on the presence and, most importantly, the properties of animals is notably gendered and provides a fertile ground for imagining a theory of the Black masculine grounded in literary analysis. Put somewhat differently, I'm interested in the ways in which Toni Morrison uses animals and birds in particular to make a certain argument about how it feels to be a Black man, how she deploys them in order not only to critique the limiting, violent ways in which Black masculinity is structured from the outside, but also to describe the means through which Black men and boys bear such weight, how they comport themselves under the duress of everyday life as a perceived threat. Following Alpha Weaver's suggestion that Black men are the summary of weight, I would like to track the way that Black masculinity as heaviness, as access, as adornment, as vanity, as exorbitance moves through Song of Solomon in the bodies of birds, how these animals rather paradoxically come to signal a certain boundness to earth, an unwieldy abundance that limits all possibility of escape or futurity. Alongside Nahum Chandler and others, however, I would like to think imaginatively about what such exorbitance avails to us as a frame for imagining alternative Black masculinities, and to begin with the premise of abundance rather than absence. Using some of Morrison's most well-known characters, Milkman Dead, his best friend, Guitar, and his father, Macon Dead, as central examples, I will close read moments of interspecies interaction with birds in the text in an effort to elucidate the generous approach to thinking Black masculinity and Black personhood in a broader sense that Morrison's work provides. By theorizing a Morrisonian vision of Black masculinity as always already bound up with a certain heaviness, a haunting presence that doubles as a kind of beauty but also prevents something like flight or a legible form of social mobility, I intend both to contribute to an ongoing conversation around representations of Black maleness and to trouble some of the arguments that have historically given coherence to that field. Following Morrison's lead, my aim is to make an argument for an unfamiliar, destabilizing constellation of masculinities, one that transcends and unmoors reductive ways of thinking the intersection of Blackness and gender. Central to this argument will be an extended consideration of the social milieu in which Milkman Dead is thrown, a world that marks and mars him from birth as the carrier of numerous traits that differentiate him from other Black men in the text. I'm interested in exploring this distance, this discomfort, at the level of feeling, and in examining what Milkman's experiences throughout Song of Solomon elucidate about the way real-world masculinities come to be formed, and how they might be critically desedimented in the service of a fugitivity that might ease the weight of living while Black and male and yet unburied, unfettered, unbowed. The opening scene of Song of Solomon betrays the novel's obsession with failed flights, its persistent concern with what happens when a body misapprehends its own unbearable heaviness. The first example of such failure in the text is deeply ironic, even to the point of tragedy, largely because of its object, a salesman by the name of Robert Smith. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance agent promised to fly from Mercy to the other side of Lake Superior at 3 o'clock. 2 days before the event was to take place, he tacked a note on the door of his little yellow house. At 3 p.m. on Wednesday, the 18th of February, 1931, I will take off from Mercy and fly away on my own wings. Please forgive me. I loved you all. Signed, Robert Smith, insurance agent. Mr. Smith didn't draw as big a crowd as Lindbergh had 4 years earlier. Not more than 40 or 50 people showed up, because it was already 11 o'clock in the morning on the very Wednesday he had chosen for his flight, before anybody read the note. At that time of day, during the middle of the week, word-of-mouth news just lumbered along. My primary interest in this scene lies in what is underemphasized or altogether unsaid. First, there is the matter of Robert Smith's profession. That Smith, a man who is well versed in the manifold dangers of everyday life by virtue of his work as a life insurance agent, and who also, it is worth mentioning, has a small yellow house that registers metonomically as a reflection of his own persistent caution or fear, would choose to engage in a public act of such exceptional risk is bizarre. This is not to say that one need work in life insurance to comprehend the dangers of jumping off a building, but the extremity of contrast is generative here, as it conveys rather vividly, the depth of Smith's conviction. The note he leaves strengthens such a reading. Its ambiguous ending initially reads, perhaps, as a suicide note, but also as a goodbye letter, and it is a reflection of the depth of thought that serves as prelude to his grand escape. This is the second sort of jarring contrast we see at work in this primal scene, the clash between the morose, deeply personal nature of Smith's note, on the one hand, and the bombastic, rather colorful character of the act itself, on the other, an act that is publicized, ostensibly, for the sake of attendance, and features unexpected flourishes, the most stark of which are the blue silk wings he dons in order to facilitate takeoff. If Smith is going to fly, he will do so in style. Note also the contrast Morrison draws between Smith's declaration of his plans to fly and the slow, lumbering manner in which the news of his experiment travels. Dreams, the argument follows, take on a kind of weight when they are put into the world. To dream aloud is to invite critique, or worse perhaps, indifference. From the first scene, Morrison places this nexus before us, the conflict between a man's desire to fly, his desire to be seen doing so, and a social world that can opt in or out of bearing the burden of that spectacle. Smith's willingness to attempt this dangerous feat, one complicated by his aforementioned career choices, is inextricable from a certain refusal of invisibility, his silken wings, as well as the note he plasters to the front of his home, both operating as embodiments of his yearning for engagement, both objects working in different ways to ensure that his plan is successful both as a mode of egress and as a means of entertainment. An aesthete, Smith wants even his leaving to be beautiful. Such flare or flash appears to be a rather recent development for Smith, and is largely out of step with how he is characterized not too long after the text's opening scene. They kidded him, abused him, told their children to tell him they were out or sick or gone to Pittsburgh, but they held on to those little yellow cards as though they meant something, laid them gently in the shoebox along with the rent receipts, marriage licenses, and expired factory identification badges. Mr. Smith smiled through it all, managing to keep his eyes focused almost the whole time on his customers' feet. He wore a business suit for his work, but his house was no better than theirs. He never had a woman that any of them knew about, and said nothing in church but an occasional amen. He never beat anybody up, and he wasn't seen after dark, so they thought he was probably a nice man. But he was heavily associated with illness and death, neither of which was indistinguishable from the brown picture of the North Carolina Mutual Life building in the back of their yellow cards. Jumping from the roof of Mercy was the most interesting thing he had done. None of them had suspected he had it in him. Just goes to show, they murmured to each other, you never really do know about people. What does it cost to be unknown or unloved? For Smith, such semi-anonymity was experienced alongside persistent abuse from his customers and fellow townspeople, an ire that is in some ways understandable given the regularity with which he asked them for money, more regular than the reaper, according to one source. This constant levying of funds, combined with Smith's relative quietude in other avenues of social life, public romance, performances of exuberance in church, and so on, served to create a rift between Smith and the rest of the social world, a dehiscence that he sought to mend in this moment of audience engagement, this final request. Over and against a reading that might lead us to understand Smith's attempt at flight as the long-awaited break of a repressed figure in search of release, Morrison's robust characterization also leaves space for a vision of Robert Smith as a man dedicated to certain forms of order and restraint, one who did not break as much as he decided to break out, break free. It is not life as such that Smith wants to escape, but rather the kind and caliber of life that is possible in the small Michigan town he wishes to be rid of. The townspeople are ultimately correct. One cannot know about another in any totalizing sense. Following Morrison's characterization of Smith as someone who never did anything more interesting than jump from the roof of Mercy Hospital, who never had a public relationship of any sort or bothered anyone beyond what was required by his job, a flock of critical questions rises to the fore. Who or what convinced Smith that he could fly in the first place? And, once such a conviction had taken hold, what would this sort of man feel the need to take flight from? At the textual level, no tenable answer to the first question appears. To the second question, however, his letter replies, albeit in muted tones. The love that Robert Smith describes, the love that is largely missing from the descriptions of Smith given by the townspeople, that is, that he is either bewilderingly dull or downright annoying, and can thus be described as an unrequited love, a love that pushed Smith to beg forgiveness not only for his leaving, but also for his dull, dogged affection. In this way, Morrison provides the reader with an entree into the effective economy of the text, one that will feature a web of relations marked by unreciprocated affection, by burden without release. Robert Smith's desire to fly is in many ways singular as it pertains to the ensemble of black male characters in Song of Solomon. The exorbitance he strains against is not rooted in vanity, a desire for revenge, or commitment to the accrual of material possessions. To be sure, these vices are primary sources of frustration for almost every other male character in the novel, but rather in his banality, the boredom and outright indifference he inspires in his neighbors and clients. In a sense, this popular perception of Smith as a forgettable figure seems almost preordained. Morrison is renowned for her flair when it comes to naming characters. What are we to make of a figure so plainly plumed, one that walks with a common name in a textual universe full of color? Consider the following passage from later in the novel, long after Smith's demise. He closed his eyes and thought of the black men in Shalimar, Roanoke, Petersburg, Newport News, Danville, in the Blood Bank, on Darling Street, in the pool halls, the barber shops, their names they got from yearnings, gestures, flaws, events, mistakes, weaknesses, names that bore witness, Macon dead, Singbird, Crowbird, Pilate, Reba, Hagar, Magdalene, 1 Corinthians, Milkman, Guitar, Railroad Tommy, Hospital Tommy, Empire State. He just stood around and swayed. Small boy, Sweet, Circe, Moon, Nero, Humpty Dumpty, Blue Boy, Scandinavia, Quack Quack, Jericho, Spoonbread, Iceman, Doughbelly, Rocky River, Gray Eye, Cock-a-doodle-doo, Cool Breeze, Muddy Waters, Pine Top, Jelly Roll, Fats, Lead Belly, Bo Diddley, Cat Iron, Peg Leg, Sun, Short Stuff, Smoky Babe, Funny Papa, Buka, Pink, Bull Moose, BB, T-Bone, Black Ace, Lemon, Washboard, Gatemouth, Cleanhead, Tampa Red, Juke Boy, Shine, Stagger Lee, Jim the Devil, Fuck Up and Dat. What does the name Robert Smith bear witness to? What mistake or weakness? What flaw or yearning? If we are to read the preceding passage as a theory of naming for Morrison, then it becomes difficult not to see Robert Smith's very name as a gesture toward either blandness, that is, that Smith has never done anything that would make him worthy of a nickname, or a long-standing distance from the sorts of social spaces and caring, playful relationships that would serve as the condition of possibility for such naming, such proximity rendered in language. Both readings dovetail in a fashion that supports the earliest descriptions of Smith. This was a man of duty with little to distract him from it, not even the love he writes about in the notes he leaves behind as a final farewell. Smith was loved without return, and in the process disinvested in more than just the town and its capacity for a certain vision of social life, but also, it would appear, in scientific law. He never frames his flight as anything other than just such an escape. All the reader is made privy to in the way of description is Smith's claim that the wings he will use as instruments of egress are all his own. Like so much else in his life, his wings are shared with no one. Robert Smith's death looms larger over the novel and serves as the connecting thread through which one can trace the critical role of animal presence and animal symbolism in Song of Solomon. Like so many of the characters that appear in the novel, once his death becomes mere memory. Smith's very person was indelibly marked not only by his inability to fly, but also by his steadfast desire to do so, even against conventional wisdom or scientific discourse. It is his yearning in the face of such facts, this exorbitant will over and against systemic boundaries that would ostensibly foreclose such streams long before one could engage in the sort of behavior for which the townspeople most vividly remember him, that is, of central concern. How does such yearning take hold? How do this novel's black men in particular, ones who live with constant reminders of their own limitations, physical, financial, and otherwise, and indeed the truth that their everyday lives are impinged upon by socio-legal restraints that function as persistent, undeniable limits, make up in their minds that this sort of groundedness, this exorbitant weight, is all they will ever know? It is in this sense, that is, as an event that opens a series of questions about how the novel's central metonymic ensemble functions as a proxy for real-world experiences of anti-Black violence, that Robert Smith's failed flight becomes an instructional moment not only for the reader but also for other characters in the text, none more so than Milkman Dead. The next day a colored baby was born inside Mercy for the first time. Mr. Smith's blue silk wings must have left their mark, because when the little boy discovered, at 4, the same thing Mr. Smith had learned earlier, that only birds and airplanes could fly, he lost all interest in himself. To have to live without that single gift saddened him and left his imagination so bereft that he appeared dull even to the women who did not hate his mother. The ones who did, who accepted her invitations to tea and envied the doctor's big dark house of 12 rooms and the green sedan, called him peculiar. This origin story, both that of Milkman Dead as the first black baby born inside Mercy, which I think Morrison intends as a kind of double entendre, a moment meant to index a geographical space of particular historical import within the narrative, but also to have us consider the various forms of mercy that Milkman is shown throughout the text, and how said mercy informs the way he comports himself, and that of Milkman's ongoing disappointment in the weight of his own body, that is, the unshakable realization that he, not unlike Robert Smith, is built for pursuits other than flight, sets up the novel's central conflict. First, the opening presents us with the question of what Milkman is to make of his own heaviness, how he is to manage a body that does not move the way he wants it to, or is read in ways that run counter to his expectations and desires. Second, the reader is made privy here to the first time that Milkman must navigate the gaze of others, in particular, the women he encounters who find him to be peculiar, a term that swings in its register between the negative and the affirmative throughout the text. Robert Smith, now dead, as the name that sutures milkman to his kin, is not especially helpful in either regard. He does not provide milkman with the tools needed to navigate either the reality of his body or the social world that unwieldy body is forced to enter. From the outset, the first encounter that milkman has with a man who might serve as the embodiment of his own future, Robert Smith, is one marked by catastrophe, by a public failure that ultimately ends in tragedy. The event leaves milkman's imagination bereft, robbing him of the joy that would naturally attend watching a man fly, as well as the possibility of such flight, such freedom, for his future self. Morrison's characterization of the Smith crash as an event that not only captures the attention of the community, but also in a slightly different register, captures any sense of potential or possibility, stealing it from milkman before he's old enough to glean that sort of disappointment from personal experience is critical. As presented, this is the first lesson milkman ever learns about what it means to move through the world, the first time he projects his own experiences onto another and dares to see himself where he is not. In this sense, Robert Smith's death is not only a mirror for milkman, but also a kind of mirror stage. It suffices to understand the mirror stage in this context as an identification in the full sense analysis gives to the term, namely the transformation that takes place in the subject when he assumes an image that is seemingly predestined to have an effect at this phase, as witnessed by the use in analytic theory or antiquities term imago. The jubilant assumption of his spectacular image by the kind of being still trapped in his motor impotence and nursling dependence, a little man is at the infant's stage, thus seems to me to manifest in the exemplary situation the symbolic matrix in which the I is precipitated in a primordial form, prior to being objectified in the dialectic of identification with the other, and before language restores to it in the universal its function as a subject. This form would, moreover, have to be called the ideal I. If we wanted to translate it into a familiar register in the sense that it will also be the root stock of secondary identifications, this latter term subsuming the libidinal normalization functions. But the important point is that this form situates the agency known as the ego prior to its social determination, in a fictional direction that will forever remain irreducible for any single individual, or rather, that will only asymptotically approach the subject's becoming, no matter how successful the dialectical synthesis by which he must resolve as I his discordance with his own reality. This passage from Jacques Lacan's The Mirror Stage as formative of the I function avails to us a peculiar sort of second insight into the initial encounter between Robert Smith's legacy, his mark, as Morrison terms it, and Milkman Dead, a protocol for imagining, at the level of trauma and psychological development, what transpires when an infant's birth is inextricably linked to a man crashing to his demise right in front of him. Though Lacan's analysis is useful for its metaphorical breadth, I would like to read against the grain of it here, so as to honor the particularity of the mirroring that passes between Milkman and Robert Smith, as I think it contains elements of the Lacanian mirror stage, but ultimately drives the subject of the stage, the child glaring into the mirror, in a slightly divergent direction than Lacan's theory, as presented here, can account for. Though there is undoubtedly a certain identification that takes place between Milkman and Robert Smith, I would argue that Milkman spends much of Song of Solomon actively disinvesting in the illogical, seemingly spontaneous activity we see from Smith in the book's earliest scenes. Milkman, like his father, Dead, is exceedingly practical. His emotions are primarily invested in what can be held or owned. Milkman does not see an ideal I in Smith, but rather an anti-ideal I, a portent, a warning of what happens when one seeks to elide or evade the law. The image of Smith's beautiful crashing body haunts Milkman. It stands in as a representative of all that he seeks to avoid, the risk of loving anything too much, even one's own freedom, and the various kinds of leaping or leaving that might attend such love. Milkman's unceasing practicality, which could also be read as willful avoidance, though certainly not a lack of something like creativity or daring, is a result of this origin steeped in blood, this cracked mirror image staring back at him from when he first entered the world. Song of Solomon is full of this sort of troublesome mirroring, replete with figures that look to elders and see versions of themselves they desperately seek to evade. Thus, the disappointment inherent to this version of the mirror stage lies not in the asymptotic approach of an ideal that never arrives, but in the disappointment of a reflection that is inescapable, a model that is marked by failure, the anti-ideal I that is always already a haunting presence that is nonetheless enfleshed. It is, to use Lacan's language, a fictional direction that will forever remain irreducible for any single individual, or rather, that will only asymptotically approach the subject's becoming, primarily in the sense that these images, these living reflections, are fixtures from which characters like Milkman are always on the run. The images approach asymptotically without ever reaching the body of the onlooker because that is as close as Milkman and others will allow them. Robert Smith is indeed a mirror, the kind that Milkman has no interest in confronting. Given the persistence of Milkman's desire to fly, a desire that manifests itself in a number of palpable ways toward the conclusion of the novel, this rejection, that is, of Robert Smith as origin narrative, as the chaos from which Milkman's world emerges, is a reasonable strategy, one that allows Milkman to conduct a relatively safe, bourgeois lifestyle without the threat of reckless dreaming. In Song of Solomon, the figure of the anti-ideal I is, from the outset, inextricably linked to images that are not mere extensions of psyche but living persons that Morrison's characters must contend with. For Milkman, the image of Robert Smith failing to fly, which is also, it should be noted, a failure to keep a promise he made in the note pasted to the front of his home, is just such a point of contention, as well as of fraught identification throughout the novel. The weight of Smith's failure lingers and ultimately manifests itself in ways that mark Milkman even beyond the supposed peculiarity that is often remarked on during his childhood, beyond what the narrator refers to as a certain dullness, which registers here not just as the absence or suppression of intelligence, but also as a lack of color or vibrancy, a doubling that is especially important given the splendor of Robert Smith's sartorial performance the day of his failing flight, and only gains more traction as the novel picks up speed, its color palette widening all the while. There remains the issue of Milkman's wounded imagination, the ways in which the Smith crash serves as a swift, irrefutable education on the relationship between black men and the limits of law. As Milkman soon learns, the algorithm is relatively simple. Bucking the law courts a quick death and ultimately makes one's life ungrievable.